Hello, my name is Dr. Thomas Cheney. I'm a lecturer in space governance at the Open University as part of the Astrobiology Research Group. My presentation today is entitled Beyond Planetary Protection, and I'll be looking at Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty and its utility as a foundation for creating an international environmental law for outer space. So I think the first place to always start is, well, what exactly is international law and how does it work? So there's sort of two primary sources for the creation of international law. The biggest and probably the most important bit is treaties. You're probably reasonably familiar with what a treaty is, but these are agreements between two or more countries which create binding international law. In outer space, most treaties are multilateral, which means that there are a huge number of countries that are party to these treaties. It's important that treaties are voluntarily entered into by states. States choose which treaties apply to them, and treaties only apply to those states that are party to the treaty. The international legal system is inherently a voluntarist system. States are only obliged to adhere to those laws in which they have signed up to. However, we do have a body of customary international law, and this develops over time through general practices undertaken by states, so long as they believe that these practices are legally required. It is a complicated system to sort of understand, and customary international law isn't really written down anywhere, but it is an important part of the process of developing international law, particularly outside of the treaty system. We also have a group of laws that are referred to as, generally speaking, as soft law, but are perhaps more accurately referred to as non-binding international agreements. These are sort of guidelines or general practices that people choose to adhere to, not because they have a legal obligation to adhere to them, but they recognize that they're the best practice for a certain topic or issue. But also there are sort of social and cultural and political things driving them to adhere to these agreements. It's also important to understand what a special regime is in international law, and this is essentially a subset of international law that focuses on a specific subject. So outer space is, for example, a special regime of international law because the body that makes up this special regime focuses specifically on space law. It only applies to outer space. It doesn't apply to other areas of international law, but it is nevertheless fits under the umbrella of international law. And so the general rules of international law apply in outer space, even though the general rules of space law don't apply to international law more broadly. We also need to think about subsequent practice and subsequent developments. And this is basically what states do after treaties come into force, and that can lead to new developments in international law, which can help drive and evolve the process forward, even without a formal amendment to a treaty or a brand new treaty. So what is space law? I've skipped over an awful lot of it because it's not particularly relevant to the question today, but the key points for us are Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the sort of the Outer Space Treaty is the core constitutional foundational treaty of space law. So it was passed in 1967 and has over 110 parties now, and it's sort of the gold standard for space law agreements. Several of the key articles for us are Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that secures space law's products as a special regime, but nevertheless part of general international law, which was more important to assert in 1967 than it is today, but is nevertheless worth keeping in mind. We've also got Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is becoming an increasingly important article as space becomes more commercial and we see more private and non-governmental actors becoming involved in outer space. And Article 6 says that states are responsible for the activities of private actors in space. And it even goes even further and says that states must authorize and continually supervise those activities. And so this means that whatever Elon Musk might want to claim, he can't do whatever he wants. He does need to get a license from the US government and potentially even other governments to get authorization for his activities in outer space. And this provides a way of making sure that non-governmental actors are playing by the same rule set as everybody else, that someone can't go and nuke Mars just because they've got millions of dollars. Then we have Article 9 in the Aerospace Treaty, and this is particularly the most relevant because this is the one that links with the Cospar Planetary Protection Policy. Article 9 has several interesting provisions. One, it says that states must have due regard for the corresponding interests of other states. Now, it doesn't particularly elaborate on what corresponding interests mean. That isn't necessarily a bad thing because it means that there's scope for interpretation. It also says the states must avoid the harmful contamination of other celestial bodies as well as contamination of Earth. Again, this links more directly with the Cospar planetary protection policies, but they're not exactly the same thing. And then once again, harmful contamination not really defined within the legal context, and it's quite a high bar to pass. Right? You not only need to contaminate a celestial body, you need to harmfully contaminate a celestial body, and that prompts some important questions. For example, harmful to what or to whom? And that's kind of a key driving question. If you don't know that there's life on Mars, can you be harmful to it? Does harm require some sort of intent? Similarly, you have a provision requiring the avoidance of harmful interference. Now, generally, this has been about ongoing activities or radio communications, but I do wonder how useful it may be to think about avoidance of harmful interference with future planned or potential activities. If you contaminate a scientifically interesting area of a celestial body, are you harmfully interfering with potential future activities conducted by, say, astrobiologists, for example? Then we come to the Moon Agreement, which is generally an ignored treaty because whilst it is a valid piece of international law, there aren't a whole lot of states that are party to it. Australia is one of the few, actually. But this comes the closest we've come to sort of international environmental law explicitly in outer space. And it's in Article 7, says to take measures to prevent the disruption of the existing balance of the environment. But again, this is kind of built on the Cospar planetary protection policies. So it's not necessarily as useful as we might want it to be. We come to the soft law, some of which I've already discussed. As I say, these are non-binding agreements. State people that do adhere to them, particularly the Cospar Planetary Protection Policy, but they're not legally obliged to adhere to them. You can't force someone to adhere to the Cospar Planetary Protection Policy. You can just shame them for not doing so, which may be more effective than threatening legal action in the international sphere, but it is an important distinction. In terms of environmentally minded soft law provisions in outer space, we've also got things like the Space Mitigation Guidelines, but we need to think about the broader sustainable development agenda. This was elaborated initially in the Rio Declaration in the early 90s, and sort of says that sustainable development is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this is sort of an idea that has become general in international governance, and it does get applied to outer space. Indeed, one of UNUSA's, the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, leading programs is about linking space activities to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can't say you're not giving consideration to the Sustainable Development Objectives when considering space activities, and that may become more relevant in a moment. So sort of backtracking a little bit to talk generally about what constitutes international environmental law. I think one of the important things to think about in terms of international environmental law is that it grew out of the regimes to manage resources, particularly things like fish and whales. So that, whilst it may feel more comprehensive today, that wasn't always the case, which may be a sort of a guidepost for how we can construct a similar regime for space. We've already talked a bit about the sustainable development thing, but this is becoming a big principle in global governance. Of making sure that we engage in sustainable development. And so, we have to query how much does this apply to space activities. And, it would be absurd for the space community to ignore the practices of sustainable development in all the rest of global governance. However, international environmental law does generally define environment as being an ecosystem. It's linked to life, even though it does include non-living elements. And the lack of life or the lack of known life in outer space may present a problem in transferring its definition. We have the further additional problem that the legal definition of the term environment is specific to the regime being examined. So the definition of environment as used in the Antarctic regime does not necessarily translate to the definition of environment in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. You can see the Chagos Island 2015 case for this sort of discussion by the ICJ. And that has pluses and minuses. That provides opportunities and problems, as I will discuss now. So I think the problem with so in international environmental law in space, that's kind of the thesis question, if you will. As far as direct applicability goes, international environmental law is too new. It's too not well enough established within its own specialized regime as applying to the environment. And as discussed, I think we'd have trouble stretching the definition of environment to outer space, at least not without some modification for the specialized regime of outer space. The core principles of international environmental law aren't sufficiently well established in public international law to be directly applied to outer space. However, all hope is not lost, as space law does have scaffolding for constructing a specialized regime. So international space environmental law isn't such an absurd notion. As we've seen, there's Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which provides us several building blocks we can build on. We've seen that the international community, in what could be called subsequent developments, or at least subsequent practice by states, does have concern for the space environment. The Cospar Planetary Protection Policy, for example, the space debris mitigation guidelines that are concerned about the proliferation of space debris. Even the Partial Test Ban Treaty, it was environmental concerns from the explosions of nuclear weapons causing disruption to satellites is why nuclear explosions in outer space are prohibited. Further, this special nature does allow for difference. So the fact that it's space environmental law can mean that we can make some distinctions from how international environmental law works in the terrestrial environment. For example, we could focus on use rather than life, making sure that space remains sustainably usable to humans, and whether that use is scientific activities being conducted on Mars and Europa, or the operations of satellites in low Earth orbit. Whatever approach we want to take, I think the key important thing to know is that this won't just happen. It needs work. It needs people to be involved in it. It needs people to keep pushing for it. It needs the development of new soft law instruments, and for people to be care and concern, and then it may happen.